Final Fantasy XVI. It has a dramatically dark and brooding story with equally dramatic and equally dark and equally brooding characters, all drawn in lush graphical detail mesmerizing the eye. Final Fantasy XVI delights the ears with sonatas and overtures which would not sound out of place at the Sydney Opera House. And most importantly, Final Fantasy XVI is carried forward by a deep and intricate combat system, requiring precise timing for sword strikes and dodge evasions, with tactical use of spell castings. Which is what I would be saying had the New Game Plus mode been the default campaign mode right from the start. Before we begin, I think it's a mistake for a reviewer to judge a piece of art on whether or not she or he likes it. Rather, a reviewer should judge a piece of work based on how effective it is in achieving the creator's goals. So, I'll be judging Final Fantasy XVI as a cinematic character action game and not an RPG. Don't worry. There will be no story spoilers. Though there will be some very minor gameplay spoilers. With that out of the way, let's go. I cannot believe Squaresoft would flatten a player's first experience through Final Fantasy XVI's main campaign in standard mode by neutering the enemies and bosses. They even outsourced FF16's gameplay design to the combat director of Devil May Cry 5, Ryota Suzuki of Capcom, to custom fashion FF16's moveset, enemies and bosses. This leads to the main point of this review. Most players are not going to experience the game, as it was intended in New Game Plus mode, if they found the standard mode boring and repetitive. You see, in every other game, the New Game Plus mode is the same as the first playthrough, roughly 15% harder, give or take. Nothing really changes all that much. And that's the assumption most players will have of Final Fantasy XVI's New Game Plus mode. Which means many players are not going to bother to try the game a second time in New Game Plus mode. If you're playing the New Game Plus mode, Clive must tactically maneuver, dodge, strike, or cast his arsenal of spells according to how assailants and bosses come at you. That's where the depth and intricacies of the combat system come into play. Use the wrong spell at the wrong time or the wrong position, well, tough luck. Now you have to wait for the spell's cooldown, and seek out the boss's next opening. Miss time and evasion, well, too bad. You're gonna take a sledgehammer, or fireball to the face. Imposing a cost on the player for being sloppy is important for gameplay depth. But for the first half of the game on your initial playthrough, the regular enemies are overly passive, probably 75% of the time. It's as if the programmers set the enemy's aggro to 20%. Maybe even lower. It's as if the game is set to debug mode, or something. And a good combat system isn't just having a large moveset with many combinations. It's having situations and conflicts which forces the player up a skill ladder towards a skill ceiling. And if the meat and potatoes of a character action game is the combat, then by definition half of that equation are the aggression of the enemies. Let's take Elden Ring, for example. A fight with Morgott has very different input timings for movement, attacks, evasions, and spells, compared to an encounter with the character that epitomizes Elden Ring's skill ceiling, Melania, Blade of Miquella. Now, I'm not saying Final Fantasy XVI's enemies and boss encounters needs to be as hard as Melania. I still have PTSD from confronting her. And that was over a year ago. Or even as hard as the later mid-campaign bosses of Elden Ring. Like the Fire Giant. What I am saying is this. During the standard mode campaign, the multi-layered combat depth of Final Fantasy XVI got flattened to just random sword swinging and firing off Clive's spells anytime you please, as there is little need for tactics, and not much input timing required. You'll simply default to the most rudimentary method of combat, since the game does not push the player up the skill ladder towards the skill ceiling. In most encounters, the nuance of the combat system is made unnecessary on the first playthrough. Nearly all the bosses are pushovers. They'll telegraph an attack, which is fine, but after executing their move the boss will have a 2 to 3 second recovery time where they're motionless, more or less, leaving you with a huge window to just wail on them. And even if you die to the boss, Final Fantasy XVI does something I've never seen any other game do. Many games don't punish the player for failing a boss fight. But Final Fantasy XVI is the only game which rewards the player for dying during a boss encounter. In the standard mode, if Clive dies during a phase of a boss fight, you don't restart the fight from the beginning of the encounter like every other game. Not only does he restarts the encounter, at the phase which he died in. For example, phase 2, the boss restarts with its health bar filled to just 3/4. And not only that, Clive will have his entire complement of health flasks maxed out, with no deduction to your in-game currency, even if he went into the fight initially with just a single flask. My guess is Final Fantasy XVI's project lead, Naoki Yoshida, as known as Yoshi P, wanted as many people to experience the narrative as possible, and was just afraid that some of Squaresoft's player base would be stuck at certain parts of Final Fantasy XVI's campaign. That's very noble and all, but the end effect of that is it leaves the player with a very tepid experience the first time through. Squaresoft would do themselves a huge favor by releasing a patch that makes the new Game Plus mode the standard campaign mode, and call the current standard mode Easy Narrative Mode, or something. Also, get rid of quick time events in boss fights. There's a reason why those died out around 2014. Almost no one loves them, though a lot of people hate them. It really kills the immersion. If you're not subscribed, now is a great time to do so. And be sure to hit like. Leave a comment, let me know what you think. I do video essays, commentary, and reviews on games. Best way to see them first is of course a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications. And as always, take care and see you around.